good. This video cutting in and out. Damn it. Connection unstable. Boswell begs Dr. Johnson to explain Aristotle's doctrine of the purging of the passions as the purpose of tragedy. Why, sir, Johnson replies, you are to consider what is the meaning of purging in the original sense. It is to expel impurities from the body. The mind is subject to the same imperfections. The passions are the great movers of human actions, but they are mixed with such impurities that it is necessary they should be purged or refined by means of terror and pity. For instance, ambition is a noble passion, but by seeing upon the stage that a man who is so excessively ambitious as to raise himself by injustice is punished, we are terrified by the fatal consequences of such a passion. In the same manner, a certain degree of resentment is necessary, but if we see that a man carries it too far, we pity the object of it and are taught to moderate that passion. Johnson's interpretation seems to be more specific than Milton's notion that to purge the passions by tragedy is, quote, to temper and reduce them to just measure with a kind of delight stirred up by reading or seeing those passions well imitated. It may be arguable whether the difference between tragedy and comedy is well defined by reference to the nobility or vulgarity of the leading characters, by the contrast between the pride of the tragic and the wit of the comic hero, by the seriousness or lightness of the tragic and comic themes, and by the passions appropriate to each. In any case, it seems clear that this division of poetry crosses the other division into epic and dramatic writing. The plays of Sophocles and the Iliad of Homer, Aristotle observes, are tragic poetry, yet dramatic and epic, respectively, in manner. But from another point of view, Sophocles is to be compared with Aristophanes, for though the one writes tragedies and the other comedies, both are dramatists. In the tradition of the great books, there are comic as well as tragic epics. Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, Rabelais's Gargantua and Pantagruel, Cervantes's Don Quixote, Sterne's Tristram Shandy, and Fielding's Tom Jones. Just as there are tragic and comic plays. The examination of those suggests that talk rather than action is the essence of comedy. The chief thing which Aristodemus remembers of Socrates' discourse the morning after the banquet in Plato's Symposium is Socrates' success in compelling Aristophanes and Agathon to acknowledge that the genius of comedy was the same as that of tragedy, and that the true artist in tragedy was an artist in comedy also. To this they were constrained to assent, being drowsy and not quite following the argument. Precisely what they assented to has never been entirely clear. On one interpretation of Socrates' remark, examples of his point are difficult to find in the great books. Except perhaps for the plays of Shakespeare, which, in the sphere of dramatic poetry, seem to represent an equal genius for tragic and comic writing. In the sphere of epic poetry, we have only Aristotle's reference to a lost poem of Homer's, the Margites, which he says bears the same relation to comedy that the Iliad and Odyssey do to tragedy. According to another interpretation, the insight of Socrates is that the totality of the great tragic vision tends to approximate the totality of the great comic vision. The same poem may be both tragic and comic because the poet has been able to see far enough into the nature of things to reveal a world which is at once dreadful and ridiculous. In this sense, Moby Dick may be both a tragedy and a comedy, though in many of its aspects, Melville writes, this invisible world seems formed in love. The invisible spheres were formed in fright. But he also remarks that there are certain queer times and occasions when a man takes this whole universe for a vast practical joke. In the science of poetics, certain principles or rules seem to apply to all the major forms of poetry, where others relate specifically to epic or dramatic writing, or to tragedy or comedy. Aristotle implies that his most general formulations hold not only for long dithyrambic poetry as well. If that is so, they should be capable of extension to other forms of lyric poetry, such as, for example, the sonnets of Shakespeare and Milton, and Milton's odes and elegies. Yet, the two principal elements in Aristotle's analysis of poetry, plot and character, seem superficially at least to belong peculiarly to narrative poems, long or short, whether they are present in any comparable manner in the structure of a lyric, or whether the form and content of lyric poetry requires an analysis peculiar to itself, are among the most difficult questions in the theory of poetry. In the tradition of the great books, there seems to be, as already observed, general agreement about the basic rules for writing narrative poetry, since these rules aim to direct the artist toward the achievement of excellence. They are also the basic principles of criticism. The science of poetics is at once an organon of production and a canon of criticism. The simple rules, such as those of plot construction, afford an example. A well-constructed plot must have a beginning, middle, and end. It must observe certain unities, at least of action, if not of time and place. Certain effects, it is held, can best be produced by the use of recognition, scenes, and reversals of fortune. Whether the events narrated are possible or impossible, the poet must at least invest them with plausibility or verisimilitude. Such rules, formulated by Aristotle and discussed by Cervantes, Fielding, and others, provide standards for judgment, whether a poem is skillfully made, as well as give directions for the attainment of skill by the poet. It may be held, of course, that the great poet works by inspiration, by divine madness, rather than by rule. That, as Theseus says, in a midsummer night's dream, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet of imagination all compact. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy, rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. But if there is an art of poetry, then, like any other art, it is a thing of rules, whether or not genius needs their guidance or can be regulated by them. The pivotal question here is, which takes precedence, the creative or the critical faculty? Does Aristotle's rule concerning the primacy of plot derive from the greatest poems of antiquity, in which he found this principle observed? Does it set up an infallible measure of excellence in narration? Or, on the other hand, do certain modern novels have an impeccable greatness despite their violation of this rule by the emphasis they place on the development of character rather than on the action in which the characters are involved? The rule of probability and necessity may, on the other hand, be inviolable. Not even the most original genius may be able to tell a good story without giving it poetic truth, according to the necessities of the characters he has created and the probabilities of the situations in which he places them. On the side of language, poetic theory seems to draw much from the art of rhetoric. The relation of rhetoric to poetics, the nature of rhetorical devices such as metaphor and simile, the choice among existing words, or the invention of new ones, are matters dealt with in the chapter on rhetoric, as well as here. Aristotle's treatment of these problems, both in his rhetoric and his poetics, lays the foundation for the traditional association of these two disciplines. In both, for example, he discusses the various modes of metaphor and their utility in achieving an expansion of meaning combined with a contraction of speech. Also, unworldly thinkers and readers of many books have to make a dime somehow. That's where poetry comes in. This in turn relates to his general maxim of style, which directs the writer to be clear without being ordinary. The clearest style, he says, is that which uses only current or proper words, but in order to avoid being commonplace or ordinary, it must be admixed with lofty diction, raised above the commonplace by the employment of unusual words. Nothing contributes more to prudence, a clearness of direction, that is remote from the commonness. Nothing contributes more to produce a clearness of direction that is remote from commonness than the lengthening contraction, and alteration of words. Phrases which are not part of current idiom gave distinction to style. But the greatest thing by far is to have a command of metaphor. This alone cannot be imparted by another. It is the mark of genius, for to make good metaphors implies an eye for resemblances. One part of Aristotle's theory of style seems to be amplified by Pascal's observation that a certain perfection is achieved by the use of those words which, if altered, would spoil the discourse. In these terms, prosaic as opposed to poetic writing does not result from the lack of a fixed meter, but rather from commonplaceness or lack of distinction in language. This standard of style does not apply to poetry alone, for just as history and philosophy may be written in prose or verse, so also may they be written poetically or prosaically. Dr. Johnson's point that poetry cannot be translated, that the beauties of poetry cannot be preserved in any language except that in which it was originally written, may be capable of the widest generalization. It may be extended to mean that writing which is poetic cannot be translated into any other form of words, even in the same language. A poetic sentence in English is untranslatable. In this absolute sense, when no alternative English phrasing is truly its equivalent. For example, it seems impossible to restate without loss or ruin Shakespeare's "Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing," or Hobbes's "Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing," or Hobbes's "Life in a state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." The other part of Aristotle's theory of style, that concerning metaphors, seems to be converted by William James into a general distinction between poetic and philosophical thought. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Into a general distinction between poetic and philosophical thought, or what he calls the splendid and the analytic. Types of intellect. Poetic thought tends to develop the implications of an analogy without giving an explication of its grounds. This, in James's view, explains the abrupt transition in Shakespeare's thought, which astonish the reader by their unexpectedness, no less than delight him by their fitness. Quoting a passage from Homer, unfathomably rich in metaphor, he says that a man in whom all the accidents of an analogy rise up as vividly as this may be excused for not attending to the ground of the analogy. The two types of intellect are rarely found in conjunction, Plato, according to James, being one of the few exceptions, whose strangeness proves the rule. On the level of thought and knowledge, As opposed to that of language, poetry is traditionally contrasted to philosophy and history, as is dictated in the chapter on history. Historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, and Plutarch emphasize the difference rather than the similarity. The historian is a reporter of fact, the poet a creator of fables or fictions. The one gains credence by his display of evidence and reasons, the other by the intrinsic plausibility of his tale. In a good poem, writes Hobbes, whether it be epic or dramatic, both judgment and fancy are required, but the fancy must be more imminent. In a good history, the judgment must be imminent, because the goodness consists in the method, in the truth. Fancy has no place, but only in adorning the style. Bacon associates poetry most intimately with history, both being concerned with individuals circumscribed by time and place, and differing only as one employs the imagination, the other the memory. Aristotle, on the other hand, finds poetry and philosophy more alike, at least to the extent that poetry, unlike history, tends to express the universal, by which he means, quote, how a person of a certain type will on occasion speak or act according to the law of probability or necessity, even if the poet, quote, chances to take an historical subject, he is nonetheless a poet. For there is no reason why some events that have actually happened should not conform to the law of the probable and possible, and in virtue of that quality in them, he is their poet or maker. In this sense, the historian also may turn poet. Referring to the speeches in history, Thucydides tells us that it was his habit to make the speakers say what was, in my opinion, demanded of them by the various occasions, of course adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what they really said. Some of the great poems, notably the Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost, and Faust, are frequently called philosophical for what appear to be other reasons, either because the discourse of their characters is weighted with doctrine, or because the poet himself is expressing a doctrine, not in particular speeches, not by argument, but in the symbolism of the poem as a whole. By these criteria, Lucretius's On the Nature of Things is a philosophical work, but not a philosophical poem. It is argumentative throughout, not narrative at all. It aims to be a literal rather than an allegorical statement of the truth. Bacon's definition of allegorical poetry as that, quote, which represents intellectual things to the senses, seems to characterize both the poetic aspect of philosophy and a distinctively philosophical type of poetry. Yet Aristotle's point that poetry and philosophy are alike may remain valid. All poetry, certainly all the great narrative poems, the great epics, the dramas, novels, and plays, deal with the abiding problems of human action and the perennial themes of human thought. It is not this moral or metaphysical content, however, which makes poetry more philosophical than history. It is the poet's treatment of such matters. In the persons and events of his story, he succeeds in giving the universal a concrete embodiment, precisely because these are only imaginary, not real particulars. They permit the abstract universal to be readily disengaged. Poets like Chaucer and Cervantes, who insist that their function is to instruct as well as to delight, do not assume the role of pedagogues or preachers. They teach, not dogmatically, but as experience does, by affording the mind the materials or occasions for insight and inference. As an artistic imitation, poetry may be better than the experience it represents. As an artistic imitation, poetry may be better than the experience it represents. It may improve upon experience as a teacher, because born of the poet's mind, it is already impregnated with ideas.